He brought both hands up to steady his gun and pulled the trigger. Later, he would not recall hearing the sound of either firearm, but saw the boy's eyes open wide as he realized he had been shot. Marcus's training had taught him to fire 2 to 3 times in rapid succession, but the first round had been enough to end the threat. The boy dropped his gun as he fell back against the van and slowly slid to the ground. Both hands went to the spreading stain of blood on his belly. His mouth opened in pain and terror, and the young boy began to scream. At that moment, the 2 other suspects ran out of the electronics store's back door. McCracken had run up behind him and shouted for them to freeze and drop to the floor of the loading dock. Numbed, Marcus held his gun on them as McCracken jumped up onto the loading dock and clapped handcuffs on both. As soon as she nodded that they were restrained, Marcus holstered his gun and ran to the wounded suspect. Dropping to his knees beside the boy, he began applying pressure to the wound, his hands pressing on the handkerchief he had pulled from his own pocket. The teenage suspect was still screaming, and Marcus himself shouted to McCracken to get help. She was already on her own shoulder microphone reporting a 1043, shooting, and ordering the dispatcher to send the emergency squad. Marcus continued applying pressure to the wound as patrol cars and other emergency vehicles appeared, their blue and red lights illuminating the alleyway. Marcus, his hands bloody from the boy's wound, took off his jacket and wrapped it around the boy to help him stay warm. His eyes caught the teen's frightened expression, and Marcus began babbling reassurances. He would later have no clear memory of the emergency squad arriving and relieving him of the task of stifling the blood pouring from the wound. Marcus would have climbed into the transport vehicle and gone to the hospital with the boy, but a police lieutenant arrived, took charge of the scene, and forbade Marcus to leave until he had provided a full verbal report. He then was required to go back to the substation to file his written report of the incident. Marcus's eyes kept filling with tears, his mouth dry as he wrote the report. Finally, 3 hours after the incident, he was told to go home and return in the morning for further debriefing. Marcus went straight to the hospital, showed his badge, and demanded a report on the suspect's condition. He was in surgery, the charge nurse told him, but expected to survive. However, it appeared his spinal cord had been involved, and they were assessing the damage. Marcus sat in the waiting area and cried. Several hours later, but in time for the morning news, the CPD public relations representative held a press conference, giving the official version of what had happened. Marcus himself was kept away from the media, away from the glare of cameras and the questions of the reporters. He was debriefed and his written report scrutinized for inaccuracies or inconsistencies. It wasn't long until the leaders in the Latino community held their own press conference and called for change in the CPD's policies, sensitivity training, and for Marcus to face unspecified charges. Marcus watched the news and heard the crowds baying for his head. Meanwhile, the boy he had shot, Ricky Vasquez, went through 3 surgeries, and his condition was upgraded from critical to fair. Marcus watched the news footage of the boy's mother hurrying into the hospital, brushing past reporters and Latino community leaders alike. 2 weeks later, Marcus testified before the grand jury and was ordered by his superior officer, Adam Bond, to present himself to the department psychiatrist for assessment. He recited what happened in answer to the prosecutor's questions for the grand jury, then again for the psychiatrist. Within a week, the psychiatrist certified him fit for duty. The only problem was that Marcus himself knew that he was not fit for duty, despite the psychiatrist's approval. Marcus knew that the thought of carrying his gun again sickened him. He also knew that he would never be able to work as a police officer again.